Thank you everyone for joining. Again, my name is Felipe and I'm here with the Charter for Compassion. Today's global read is the Healing the Heart of Democracy. This is the updated version that wrote Mr. Parker J. Palmer, who we have the honor to have here. And the conversation will be moderated by Rabbi Ariel Berger, who's going to be our facilitator. And I'll be taking a couple more minutes at the end of the conversation so that I can tell you a little bit more about what's going on with the Charter for Compassion. But for now, Mr. Parker Palmer, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Felipe, and my thanks also to the Charter for Compassion for choosing Healing the Heart of Democracy as its global read. Certainly in the U.S., where I'm located, it's a timely choice because in a very short period of time, as you know, we have a general election coming up. I'm really delighted to have my friend and colleague Ariel Berger with me today to explore this book and so many of the issues related to democracy. Good morning, Ariel.
Good morning, Parker. It's so good to be with you. And I'm also grateful to the Charter for Compassion for all of the great work and hosting this really important conversation.
Ariel, as I hope you will know and maybe learn more later, heads up the Witness Institute, which is devoted to spreading the work and the spirit of Nobel Peace Prize winner Elie Wiesel, who was Ariel's friend and teacher for many, many years. So we're going to dive right in to the book with the quote that helped inspire me to write this book in the first place. The key idea that was a kind of spark of ignition, helping me bring together a lot of feelings, a lot of thoughts, a lot of ideas back in 2008 when the book first appeared. And that quote is from a wonderful, wonderful American writer named Terry Tempest Williams. She says, "The human heart is the first home of democracy. It is where we embrace our questions. Can we be equitable? Can we be generous? Can we listen with our whole beings, not just our minds, and offer our attention rather than our opinions? And do we have enough resolve in our hearts to act courageously, relentlessly, without giving up ever, trusting our fellow citizens to join with us in our determined pursuit of a living democracy?" We're going to be exploring, Ariel and I, not only the content of that quote, but the implications of the quote. And before we dive into that, I want to say just a couple of words about why I found Terry Tempest Williams so striking. She says the human heart is the first home of democracy. Every class I ever took in school on democracy located the first home in a document or in a set of wise people or in a time and a place in the world when the democratic experiment got underway. Terry Tempest Williams adds what I think is as 50% of the equation of democracy, which is what's going on inside the human being, the formation or deformation that either invites people to become citizens of a democracy or deforms them into being subjects of an authoritarian political system. It's a wise quote because she's not saying that the heart will inevitably lead us towards democracy. She's wiser and savvier than that. The human heart is capable of leading us in all kinds of directions. The human heart has produced everything from amazing good to devastating evil. She's saying the heart is the battleground where we duke it out with ourselves, in a struggle between what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature and the lesser angels of our nature. It's where we wrestle with the big questions of our lives. And each of us needs to be highly attentive to how that wrestling match is going around the questions that Terry Tempest Williams names about generosity, about being equitable, about listening to each other with care. Ultimately, it's a quote that lands a big part of the responsibility for democracy back in our laps, which is exactly where it needs to be, especially in a system that's premised on the power and authority of we the people, as is the case with the US Constitution. So with that much being said, Ariel, where do you want to go from here?
Well, thank you, Parker. That was a beautiful way to begin. And I'm coming into this conversation with a deep awareness that education and reading and conversations like this one are deeply moral acts in a moment of great moral challenge in the world in so many levels, in so many ways. And the way that education can serve as a form of resistance against demagoguery and other forces that would manipulate us is something that's very much on my mind. And so I'm so grateful for the book again and again, and for the reissuing and the updating of the book. And one of the things that you do in the book, which is so powerful, and you just spoke to, is that you take really large abstract ideas like democracy and you bring them back home to us, which gives us both responsibility and also a kind of empowerment. And so you bring it back to our lives, our hearts, our families, our communities. And I want to start with a question about one of the key principles that you invoke in the book. It's related to the Terry Tempest Williams quote. And I think it's one that we all recognize as human beings, which is not only the place of the heart, but the place of heartbreak in driving and defining so much of our public and political lives together. And the principle that you describe is that, as we know, life can be heartbreaking, and so many of us are experiencing pain and anguish and anxiety about the world now, and there's so many reasons to feel those things. And what you talk about beautifully and powerfully, and it's affected me personally very deeply over the years, is how we hold our heartbreak will determine the direction of our politics and our culture and our shared life together, our shared destiny. And early in the book, you write about two kinds of heartbreak. I'm quoting now. The first is the conventional image of a heart exploded into 1,000 shards. And this is on page 22, if anyone wants to follow along. And that kind of heartbreak, which is like a grenade and explodes into 1,000 shards, can lead to despair or injury to others. It's an unresolved wound, you write, that keeps on wounding us and others. But there is a second type of heartbreak, you write, when the heart is supple. When the heart is supple, it can be broken open into a greater capacity to hold suffering in a way that opens us to greater compassion. And this kind of heartbreak is a source of healing. So when I read this, I thought of the great Hasidic teaching that nothing is as whole as a broken heart, which you and I have spoken about before. And that suppleness, it's such a perfect word for describing this second kind of heartbreak, is critical, that we develop this kind of suppleness so that when our hearts break, which they inevitably will, they won't be grenades. They will break into greater compassion. And my question for you is, how do we develop this suppleness of heart?
Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful question, and I'm glad you went directly there, because this gets to the heart of the pain and suffering that so often deform our politics, when in fact we ought to be deploying power in the relief of pain and suffering. Politics is all about deploying power, and it's all about understanding properly and clearly the relation between means and ends. And what are the means and ends that serve the purposes of love, truth, and justice? I wrote the book in 2008 during a period of personal heartbreak. Some of that was in my own individual life, but part of it was in the midst of the presidency of Barack Obama, when I became quickly and painfully aware of how white supremacy was rising up against President Obama and his family in ways that can only be described as evil. And I found it heartbreaking that this moment in American history when we had a chance to break through into a multicultural, multiracial society in a healthy, creative way under intelligent leadership, was instead being used to drive us back to America's original sin, which was the enslavement of human beings of color to ground and found the American economy. A sin we're still living with and have a long way from, have not come far enough in reckoning with. So heartbreak became, a very central consideration for me as I was writing the book. And I began to realize that the supple heart is something that you don't develop just when the crisis hits. In fact, if you haven't attended to developing suppleness of heart, the crisis is going to shatter it. And all around me, I could see then, and I can see even more now, the broken heart being hurled as a fragment grenade at the ostensible source of its pain. And that image still is very resonant for me about what's going on in American politics. But to develop a supple heart over a lifetime, I think means being honest and open with ourselves and with those close to us about the little deaths that occur in our lives. The failure of an ambition, the loss of a friendship, the death of a dream at any age. It happens all the time. These are not terminal heartbreaks, but we often blow past them saying, don't worry about me, I'll be okay, rather than inhabiting them, walking around in them, inviting trusted others to be present to us in that suffering, and exercising the heart muscle toward suppleness, the way an athlete stretches muscles and tendons in order that they won't snap under high performance, peak performance conditions. I see it all the time at age 85, to just add one more note to a very large topic, as people I know and love lose folks to death who have been dear and near and central to their lives. The pattern for many of them is to go into a long underground period of feeling that life will never be good again. How can they possibly function without this beloved person by their side? And yet, as they emerge through the healing tincture of time, they discover that not in spite of the heartbreak, but because of the heartbreak, because of the loss, they have become larger, more capacious people, more generous, more welcoming of the struggles of other people, more befriending of life in its fullness and its totality. And those, I think, are people who have developed the habit over the years of exercising the heart towards the kind of suppleness that we're talking about. And to build a little bridge towards the next set of ideas that we want to talk about here, Ariel, I'll just say that I'm very interested in the question of how families, voluntary associations like religious communities, schools themselves at every level can help people develop supple hearts, can engage human beings around that Terry Tempest Williams quote, and help us understand that these struggles aren't just intellectual struggles. They're emotional struggles, they are existential struggles, and they can be turned toward good ends. Psychologists, I was interested to learn this while writing the book. Psychologists study the downside of stress, and they have a word for it, distress. distress is not a good thing. It strains us physically and it strains us psychologically. But there's another word that psychologists use called eustress, which is tension that brings life to us, tension that keeps us awake, tension that creates curiosity, tension that induces growth and learning, eustress, eustress. And I think families and voluntary associations and schools and other venues can help us experience the kind of creative tension that helps grow the heart and make the heart supple.
Mm. Thank you. I think, when I first read the book years ago, my first very strong response was, this is a much more realistic book about politics than any other book I've ever read about politics, because it incorporates all of those levels of human reality and existence and behavior. We are emotional and psychological beings, and we are more than that. And so if we're only addressing political questions on the level of politics or policy, and we're not looking at the stories behind the policies and the people behind the stories, we're missing something really critical. It's not a luxury. It's not extra credit. And so I really appreciate you reinforcing that. And when you talk about these moments, the little deaths that allow us to practice suppleness of heart, it does lead us directly to those smaller scale moments with family, community, voluntary associations, religious communities, etc., in which we practice. And as you were just speaking, I had an image of the moments years ago for me now when our kids were little and we would be rushing to get them off to school. And the kids are running around getting their stuff together, and we're making the lunches and packing the lunch boxes if we didn't do it the night before, which we often didn't. And there's time pressure, and something comes up. There's a wrench in the works, and one of the kids needs something or realizes something. And then we have a tiny political moment, a moment of listening or not, honoring or not, negotiating well or not. And those are the moments when we not only teach our children, but we practice for ourselves how to become political beings. So that's a critical thread in the book. And you just set it up for us beautifully. I want to add a quote from the book to the conversation and ask you about it. And you wrote, and you've spoken about this often, the pre-political layer of common life upon which our social fabric depends is so tattered. And as a consequence, democracy is endangered. And so family, neighborhood, voluntary associations, workplaces, public spaces, all have roles, critical roles to play in a democracy. And they allow us to do what we call political work and what you call inculcating habits of the heart that has nothing to do with partisanship, but is aimed at nurturing the gift of democracy itself. And I'd love for you to speak a little bit about that pre-political layer of life and the nonpartisan gift of democracy. What do you mean exactly by that?
Well, let me give credit where credit is due, and thank you for the question, and also for the family memories you just brought back of those hard-pressed mornings before people are off to their various locations. So credit where credit is due belongs to a French nobleman named Alexis de Tocqueville, who was struggling with questions of democracy, having been present during some of the critical events of the French Revolution. He visited this very young country, the United States of America, in 1831 and 32. And if you think about it for a minute, it wasn't easy to get around in those days. There was no instant communication or transport available. And it's astonishing how much Alexis de Tocqueville learned during a one-year visit to this very, very young country. What he learned became the basis for a book called Democracy in America that is to this day one of the arguably best books about American democracy ever written. And it was Alexis de Tocqueville's insight that what was different about this country as compared to the rigid class structure in Europe and the monarchical societies that were in such trouble at the time was that this country had a rich quilt of civic life laid out across the land. People were gathered in families, they were gathered in neighborhoods, they were gathered in voluntary associations, they were gathered in public spaces. Um, Voluntary associations, of course, including religious organizations, which struck de Tocqueville markedly because he had come from an essentially secular society where getting rid of religion seemed to be the way to go. And he realized that in this country, the variety of expressions of religion in organizational form was actually enriching the democratic possibility. And what he saw going on in each of these places was people working to shape their own hearts and to shape other people's hearts in a form that would make them better citizens of a democracy. I got fascinated with the idea of this being a pre-political layer of life, as you say, a non-partisan layer of life, because at the time I was working with so many people, and I don't think these people are hard to find yet today, who were saying, no, no, I don't want to get involved with politics. That's dirty stuff. That's messy stuff. I'm in over my head. It always goes toward partisanship. It's divisive. It generates anger and bitterness and resentment. I just don't want to be political. Well, for one thing, to be alive is to be political, since politics has to do with how we deploy power or not for the sake of the common good in pursuit of love, truth, and justice. And whether you're engaged or not, you are helping to answer that question. But here's in this pre-political layer of life, all of those objections to politics disappear because we're not talking about which candidate is better or which policy is better. We are weaving and reweaving the fabric of life on which a democracy depends, the fabric out of which come citizens who understand what it means to hold the tensions involved in democracy in a creative way that keeps building and rebuilding, weaving and reweaving the common good. It's a widely known fact that the pre-political life in this country has declined in the last third of a century or so. When Robert Putnam at Harvard wrote his well-known book, Bowling Alone, he sort of started ringing the death knell for all of those places that Alexis de Tocqueville named, where democratic habits of the heart get generated. But I'm an ever hopeful person, and I think that I believe that deep in the human spirit is a desire to gather with others in some of the ways that Alexis de Tocqueville talked about, and in ways that are part of the emergent society, where technology plays a larger role in our lives, obviously, than it did in de Tocqueville's time or than when I was growing up. And so I think even today I feel a resurgence of that desire to associate with one another, to reach across the lines that divide us. I don't think the national media reflect that resurgence very well, but I see it going on even now in the midst of a very heated political campaign as people struggle to listen to one another and rebuild some of the venues of our common life on which democracy so deeply depends. So as you know, Ariel, I name in the book 5 habits of the heart that I think we need to keep our eyes on as we occupy these various venues of life, like family and neighborhood and friendship groups, et cetera.
it's caused me to experience taking a train between cities or a subway or a bus differently. The awareness that we have a moment of opportunity to at least be aware of the people around us and not just disappear into our screens and that kind of targeted narrow gaze and the blinders that come with it. And it also is deeply empowering to think that we can practice the habits of the heart and we can become more deeply democratically literate and empowered in daily life. It's not just in the halls of power. And that there's a connection between those small gestures, those small moments, and those large systemic change issues that we all are concerned about. That's really powerful. I think about the famous Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility.
Mhm.
And I think about the inverse, with great responsibility comes great power. And so when we take more responsibility for the world around us, and even in small ways, at small scales, we find a greater depth of not only empowerment, but wisdom, often insight, intuition that can help us, that can guide us. So you're creating a kind of doorway between the large and the small that I really come back to very often in my life and in my
Mm.
work.
Mm.
You mentioned,
Thank you for the Spider-Man reference. I'm often called Peter Parker by younger folks who confuse my name with Spider-Man's street name. So it's nice to hear a positive reference to Spider-Man.
I've got to tell you, I know this is a slight footnote to a footnote, but I once saw a Spider-Man comic. I did not document it. I wish I had. I'm going to look for it again, where someone gets Peter Parker's name wrong and calls him Parker Palmer. I kid you not. This is in a Marvel Comics Spider-Man comic panel. I may have a photo of it somewhere. It exists. So there's some sort of mutuality there.
Yeah, I guess I've had my 15 minutes then.
Yeah, I think you've done more good uh, overall than Spider-Man. And I think that you mentioned the habits of the heart, and you really ground us in specific practices in all of those moments, in all of those contexts, small, larger, family, community, civic organizations, and so on. And as we discussed in advance, we thought it would be good to walk through those habits of the heart and give you an opportunity to help us unpack them and flesh them out a little bit. So let's start with the first one. And the habits of the heart are really throughout the book, but also there's a terrific guide in the back with the habits individually and specific questions and quotes and video interviews and talks with you that people can watch to go deeper into the way that you address each habit. And the first one is an understanding that well, actually, before I say that, one of the things that you offer in the book is that the 5 habits of the heart are really a combination of chutzpah and humility. And so we can pay attention to that maybe as we go, where do those come up? And it begins with, I think, curiosity and humility with the first several of the habits. And the first one is an understanding that we are all in this together, that we are deeply interconnected as a species, and that we are entwined with one another and all forms of life, and that all of the large-scale systemic issues point to that interconnectedness. Can you say a bit more about that, what it means to you, how you came to it, and what it means for us?
Yeah, and I'm aware, Ariel, as I'm sure you are too, as our time flies in this pretty brief webinar about a very large topic, that we probably can't spend too much time on each of these 5 habits, lest we get in the way of the questions that I think people are sending in to the chat and I guess on Facebook as well. Let me just clear my throat for a moment here. So an understanding that we are all in this together. In the US, as I have experienced this society for the last 85 years, this is a hard sell, this notion that we're all in this together, because this stream of individualism, rugged individualism that runs through the American experience is so very strong. But the evidence of life keeps coming back and telling us, no, you're not doing this alone. Nobody does it alone. And it's not only that you are connected to, and in my case at least, deeply indebted to family, friends, ancestors who have helped you become the person you are and have helped you by holding your struggles as well as celebrating your joys. You're also connected intimately, more intimately than you know, to people very far away whom you will never meet. One of my early books was called The Company of Strangers, because I was so struck by how people I will never meet impact my life. I would have thought that from the pandemic, Americans might have learned something about this, that a deadly virus can arise halfway around the world and within a very short period of time can be killing way, way too many people here in the United States as well as elsewhere around the globe. I would have thought that the part of the lesson of the pandemic was we suddenly start learning about supply chains that interfere with our ability to get our toaster repaired or a window replaced or a product that we want in the grocery store, because this great chain of being is so widely and meaningfully linked. Russia's war on Ukraine, and the world suffers from a lack of grain. Who would have thunk? And so if we pay attention to daily life, I think we start realizing we are all in this together. We're not doing any of it by ourselves. We stand on the shoulders always of other people, and we have to play our role in upholding others as well.
Thank you. It makes me think about what I think of as our moral footprint. You know, the clothes that we buy are sometimes made by children in sweatshops and sometimes slave labor in the Uyghur community, for example. And so we really have to think about the interconnectedness and the implications for our responsibilities globally and systemically. Yeah, thank you. The second habit of the heart is an appreciation of the value of otherness. And you
To
talk
me,
about
yeah, to me, this is a no-brainer, because it's very easy for me to imagine how dull my life would be if the only people I had hung out with and interacted with and worked with and laughed with and um, built things with were folks who were white and male and Protestant Christian. Um, Dull is an understatement of how my life would feel if my life had been wrapped forever in the homogeneity in which I grew up. Um, I've never done a lick of growing, I think, intellectually, spiritually, morally, in terms of practical skills, without encountering otherness from which I learned. And I'm so deeply convinced that not only in individual life, but in our collective life, otherness and diversity contributes to stability, to resilience, to innovation. It's simply a life enriching factor that makes me wonder deeply about why it is that so many people fear otherness, why it is that so many people, including some of our would-be leaders, lie about otherness in order to gain political traction by dividing us from one another, the very ancient divide and conquer strategy. So critical to democracy is an understanding that since we are all in this together, we have to help each other understand the remarkable, profound, transformative benefits of human diversity.
Thank you. You're right. The stranger has much to teach us. And I love that. It's raising the threshold. As my teacher, Elie Wiesel, used to say, we don't tolerate each other. you tolerate a cold or a flu, we need to really deeply respect each other. And the litmus test, I think, is, are we willing to really learn from the other, from the stranger?
Right.
So,
My heart has never leapt when somebody has said in a conversation, well, Parker, I'm willing to tolerate you, but that's about all. That's pretty thin soup, isn't it, for
yeah,
for trying to build community.
yeah, yeah. The third habit of the heart is one that seems to be at the center, maybe for a reason. I wondered about that throughout. An ability to hold tension in life-giving ways. And
Well,
this
yeah.
creative tension holding is so central for all of your work, I think.
Yeah, and this is one on which we could spend another hour, but we don't have that hour. And I really am eager to get at some of the questions that I assume are coming in that folks might like to have addressed. I don't want to let that fall by the wayside. So let me name, if I may, the the last three habits of the heart, and then try to say a summary word about them. An ability to hold tension in life-giving ways, that's number three. A sense of personal voice and agency is number four. And a capacity to create community is number five. Um, there's no way to overstate the importance of learning to hold tension in life-giving ways. Not only is that a source of personal growth intellectually, spiritually, in every way I can imagine, but it is also the genius at the heart of the structure of at least the United States form of a democratic society. Um, the division of powers, the tripartite division of powers in our country, the executive, judicial, and legislative, were meant to create what I call a loom of government on which to hold the tension of diverse threads and ways of looking at issues and resolving issues. And what's critical is that those three branches of government not be in each other's hip pockets so that the tension does get hold and a system of checks and balances is able to kick in. That was the founding genius of this country, a genius that has allowed us to slowly and often with a lot of pain and suffering to correct some of our original sins and at least to begin to mitigate some of the mistakes that got made in the building of this more perfect union. Um, if that's going to happen, then we all need to claim our sense of voice and agency, and we all need to understand we can't do this ourselves. We must gather with others in community to help make good things happen. And maybe with that, we ought to turn to questions, Ariel, do you think? And see if there's some ways we can weave together the rest of what we had hoped to do with the questions themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We do have some questions coming in. And the first one I'd like to point us to and ask you is, since, and this is from Facebook, since politics are a topic close to the heart, what are some tips to not get into arguments or fights when we differ on basic opinions that go against what we're seeing generally? We have strong opinions about policies and actions that we believe are not right or beneficial for all. The strong feelings can often interfere with our ability to hold space for dialogue and for holding tension with others in life-giving ways. So what are some recommendations you have for creating space and the conditions for those kinds of positive, constructive conversations?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for a really important question. And let me say that as I answer that question, I'm talking to myself as well as to the person who asked the question, because I am myself a work in progress on all of this. And there are days when I fall, into the very pits that I'm trying to warn us against. So please understand that while I do my best to practice uh, these things, They are also aspirational for me because I think aspirations help us grow. So the first thing I want to say is when I'm talking with another person across a great divide, one of the interior questions that always comes to me is it more important in this moment for me to be right? Or is it more important for me to do what I can to maintain a right relationship with this person? And I would hope that I would most of the time be able to say to myself, maintaining a right relationship is more important than being right. Not only because I don't want to bust relationships up just willfully and whimsically, but because these are complicated questions in many cases, and it takes time in relationship to work them through. And if I can't create that container of right relationship, we just won't have that time. This will be the last time we talk. Um, so that's an orientational question that I ask myself. What I do practically and positively that works most often for me is I turn from the position that that person takes in contrast to the position that I take on that issue. I turn away from that toward the personal story behind whatever that position may be. I turn toward curiosity. I turn toward wonder. I wonder what life experience this person has that leads him or her to this conviction. And I ask about it. And I also wonder at the same time what it is about me that's making me so brittle or so rigid or so defensive about the conversation that's going on, which is, if I can do it honestly and well, is an exercise in humility. So I think curiosity helps a lot. Tell me your story helps a lot. Um, let me tell you some of my story. Let me make myself vulnerable to you. And I've had experiences where that storytelling did in fact bring us closer together. Not that we ended up agreeing with each other on issues that about which both people had strong and deeply held convictions, but that we understood each other better, and in that sense had done what we could to maintain the right relationship that might lead to yet another conversation. I think haste and the desire to just get something settled right now, which is a killer in things of this sort. We have to understand that being in this for the long haul is what matters, whether the long haul is our own lives and our own relationships, or the building of a democracy, which the founders knew from the get-go would always be an unfinished experiment, always be at risk, and which needed constant vigilance and care.
Thanks, Parker. This is such an important question right now, and we're seeing a lot of, I'm seeing a lot of places where constructive dialogue breaks down and is breaking down. And as you said or implied, we become smarter together, we become wiser together, and we are checks and balances to each other. All the assumptions and unexamined blind spots that we walk around with can only really be challenged by someone with a different perspective. So when I see an other who's truly other, has a different opinion or perspective, I can say, oh no, or I can say, oh yes, what an opportunity. And to some degree, I think it's a choice, but I also think it's a practice. It's something that we need to learn to do better and become more comfortable with that discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for that. It's really interesting. The first two questions represent two sides of this dynamic of chutzpah and humility that you write about, and I know think about a lot in this book and in general. Because this first question is, what if you have an excess of chutzpah? What if you have an excess of what I think of as moral ferocity or conviction. I feel so strongly that I don't want to be in dialogue with someone else. And you just spoke to that. The second question I want to share from the chat is, how do we inspire youth or other disenfranchised people to become more involved with politics? What if there's an excess of humility and people have a hard time finding their voice? How do we empower? How do we invite? How do we open the door for people to get more involved?
That's another critically important question, and again, could be the focus of another hour or two or three. But let me frame it this way. This is how I think about that question. And I think a lot of young people have no sense of their own voice or don't want to use their own voice because they grow up in institutions and settings which never invite them to speak their own voice. They are so often, let us just take two institutions, religious and educational, they are so often being formed, or I would say deformed, by institutions where experts at the front of the room are telling them what they need to learn to say if they want to pass the course or, pass muster. And that kind of systematic disempowering of voice and of a sense of agency naturally leads to folks in their teens and 20s who simply either don't feel that they have anything to say or feel that what they have to say is unwelcome in settings run by older folks. I think we need to turn the table significantly in our religious and educational institutions, those places where young people spend a lot of time, certainly in education, if not in religious institutions, they spend a lot of time. We need to focus less on competition, educational competition, and more on collaboration. We need to put more power in the hands of students to come together in teams, to work out solutions to problems and issues. What's interesting to me is, having worked in the educational space for 60 years, is that we have a ton of research which shows that kind of communally based, engaged educational practice actually makes people smarter, and what they know remains with them for a longer period of time and becomes more operational than does the top-down teaching of what the experts think on X, Y, or Z. So we have research saying that what we proclaim to be the aims of education, to prepare people for life in the workforce, or to prepare people for citizenship, or to prepare them to do this or that, any of the basic functions of modern life, is better done in a mode of teaching and learning that actually inculcates and evokes voice and agency than in one that shuts it down. So I'm left with the question, why do we keep doing things the way we've done them for centuries, with the top-down, banking model of education, depositing things in students' minds and imagining that somehow is going to make a difference. I think the reason has nothing to do with the weakness of young people. I think it has a lot to do with the laziness of adults, of the older folks who don't want to bust out of the mold in which they were educated and do the hard learning that's going to come by trying to develop pedagogical alternatives. I wrote a book about that called The Courage to Teach. It's something I've thought about a lot, and I think it's the only way I have of answering a very good question.
These books together are a kind of canon for thinking about the work of the heart and the translation of that work into practical terms. And there are several questions, and we're probably not going to have time to get to all of them. So apologies. And this, of course, could be a much longer conversation, as you've said. But there's one question that I think represents the moment we're in the sense that these are not normal times. We're looking at challenges to democracy and to some of the fundamentals of things that we've taken for granted for generations, and probably never should have. But we're seeing breakdowns in communication and profound polarization and the rise of hate-filled movements that we thought were marginalized and put to bed in certain ways. So there's a question here about going back to the balance of power and the three branches and the positive tension that you described earlier. We're in a moment of extreme distress in the balancing of these branches, the balancing of these powers. We've been here before, thinking of pre-Civil War America. How do we make sure we don't end up in bloodshed again?
Well, I don't think we can make sure that we don't end up in bloodshed again. I just had a long conversation with a wonderful writer, activist named John Paul Lederach, who for years was the professor of international peace building at Notre Dame University and has been on the front lines of many war-torn situations where blood was shed and reconciliation was the long-term goal. And he has a new booklet out, which is available on Amazon, called Facing Down a Civil War, or words to that effect. It's a 100-page piece that's full of a lot of wisdom. And again, such a complicated question, and so much depends on what we have or haven't done in the past. But I do think, and I say this in the introduction to the new edition of Healing the Heart of Democracy, that one of the things that has seems so clear in our time is that we are now being asked to hold tensions that cannot always be held creatively. And let me give an example of what I'm trying to say. Creative tension holding is a possibility whenever you can imagine finding a middle ground between two opposing positions, or whenever you can imagine the mind and heart being stretched open enough to find a transcendent third thing, as the philosophers say, a position that neither of the contestants to that argument had imagined, but that emerges through creatively holding their differences. That's what creative tension holding is all about. When you can see that possibility, no matter how distant, then you are invited to hold that tension faithfully and well as long as you can, and make yourself vulnerable to the work it wants to do in you. But when you cannot imagine a middle ground, when you cannot imagine a transcendent third thing, that's the time when the only words I know are the old civil rights anthem, "We shall overcome." That has to be overcome. And I can give you an immediate example or two. When the tension is between a bunch of people who want to gather in the Michigan state legislature and hammer out some policy questions that are critical to our democracy, and another bunch of people who want to say, yeah, we'll come to that, but we'll bring our AK-15 assault rifles into the mix. That's not an invitation to hold a creative tension. That's a place for the rule of law to overcome. When the conversation is about who is the superior race of all the races on the face of the earth, and who is it that should be banned or deported from our country on racial grounds alone, that's not a creative tension. that one can hold. Only all you can say is we shall overcome. That's the core struggle of our time. And we do have choices to make between the rule of law and the rule of men or a man. We do have choices to make between nonviolent ways of solving our problems and violent ways of solving our problems. So it's not, we have devolved to a point in American political life where the structures offered to us by the founders have shown weakness. And we don't have time here to go into the various ways that people are proposing to deal with those weaknesses. But those ways exist. And what cannot be done or won't be done by today's Supreme Court could be done by the United States Congress, depending on the outcome of the next election. So
Parker,
we
sorry,
leave,
and we've got about a minute left.
we leave democracy where it always is left, which is in a state of suspension, in a state of both repair and disrepair, in a place where what we do counts enormously. I'm going to read one final brief quote from the book to, I hope, land this discussion where I just tried to land it. The democratic experiment is endless unless we blow up the lab, and the explosives to do the job are found within us. But so also is the heart's alchemy that can turn suffering into community, conflict into the energy of creativity, and tension into an opening toward the common good. So at that point, with gratitude to you, Ariel, and to the Charter for Compassion, I'll just say amen.
I will too, Parker, and I think we all will. I'll say also that if this feels to everyone like a teaser and there's so much more you want to learn, read the book, read it again. I keep returning to it. It's a very powerful source of strength and clarity and motivation to do this critical work at multiple scales, in the most intimate, small, modest ways, and at larger scales. And I know Felipe has to make some announcements, so I will close there as well and just say thank you so much, Parker, and thank you to the Charter for Compassion for creating this space, and thank you all for being here.
You just took my words away. Thank you both for this incredible conversation. I think there's so much that we can take, especially during these times, especially for so many countries that are going through election years this year. So all the information that was provided was so valuable, and we really appreciate that. Also, I want to apologize to people that had questions asked that we didn't have enough time to answer them, but I hope that with rewatching this video, which will be posted on our YouTube channel later on, you'll be able to see more and stay in touch with the websites that we have put on the chat. So let me just share really quickly what is going on with the Charter for Compassion for the upcoming weeks. Our Charter Sangha, our Circle of Compassion, where we meet and talk about, and we have a moment of reflection, meditation. We do this every last Saturday of the month. So this case, September 28th at 9 a.m. Pacific time. And with the link that I posted on the chat, you'll be able to register there. We have the Charter Education Institute, the branch that teaches and has courses online. On Thursday, October 14th, we begin with Cultivating Happiness in Life with Imam Jamal Rahman, who is part of the Interfaith Amigos, an incredible presenter and teacher. And so you also can register that with our link in the chat. We have Empathic Dialogue Cafes every first Tuesday. So that means October 1st at 9 a.m. Pacific. And we have our global read on October 16th with, again, Imam Jamal Rahman on spiritual fragrance of the Quran. And the conversation will be moderated by Rabbi Laura Duhan Kaplan and Pastor Donald McKenzie, who are also part of the Interfaith Amigos. So we have a great conversation there as well. And don't forget that every Wednesday, Marilyn Turkovich, our executive director, takes her second side job, which is DJ virtually, and takes us through a journey of music about the harmony of humanity. And so that is every Wednesday at 8 a.m. Pacific time. And again, you can check that out on our event calendar page. And last but not least, we have our EdNet Forum, Thursday, October 17th at 7:30 a.m. Pacific, The Power of Films to Teach Global Citizenship and Media Literacy. And this is going to be with Virginia Pitaro of the SIMA Academy. So, oh, I'm sorry, one more. The kitchen table chat conversations. This is for anyone that is involved in the health sector. So any sort of like health initiatives or policy that is going on in your communities, in our compassionate community or on your own, we would love to hear from you every first Friday at 8:30 a.m. Pacific time. And so with that, my friends, thank you once again, both of you, for having this rich conversation, for all participants and everything that you provided. We will be receiving an email with the recording, with the link of the recordings to our YouTube channel, so you can rewatch this and share with others. Thank you so much, and we'll be seeing you our next Global Read in the middle of October. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.